My name is Anand Khanna. I am the manager of motion picture programs here at Actsafe. Welcome everybody to this morning's webinar. One other little note I want to make you aware of. We do have live transcription available as well for this webinar. If you click on the little CC button at the bottom of the screen, you will be able to control what level of closed captioning you want to see on your screen. So it's another thing that is available to you for this morning's session. Actsafe presents Preventing Extreme Heat Exposure in Arts and Entertainment Workplaces. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge and honor that Actsafe's offices and classrooms are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, Quechua, Tsleil-Waututh, and Stamina peoples. For the rest of us attending virtually online, I urge you to learn more about the ancestral lands you reside and work on. You can do this by visiting a website called nativeland.ca. That's native-land.ca, and they have a map on this website where you can hone in on where you live, where you work, and learn a little bit more about the lands that you occupy. So let's get into what we're really here to talk about, heat exposure. So 2021 was an interesting year, yeah? We were still in the midst of COVID-19. Atmospheric rivers and wildfires all had a hold on this province, but one of the things that really affected workers last summer was the heat dome. Okay, sustained periods of high temperatures produced conditions that not many people were prepared for. And while we have escaped the same levels of high temperatures thus far this year, working in periods of extreme heat is something we all need to be better prepared for. And we hope that this morning's webinar provides us with some insight and resources to plan on working in extreme hot conditions before those conditions take effect. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Prescillia Chua. So Prescillia Percy Chua is Manager of Risk Analysis Unit at WorkSafeBC. She leads a team of human factor specialists and prevention officers to assess workplace risk and implement critical controls. She is accredited as a certified industrial hygienist, registered occupational hygienist, and a Canadian registered safety professional. And she has more than 18 years of experience in evaluating industrial and occupational exposures at work practices. So it's my pleasure to introduce you all and turn things over to Percy to continue on.
All right, good morning and thanks for inviting me today. I'd first also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. So at WorkSafe, I've been in several roles. First as a prevention officer that I inspect a variety of employers within healthcare, manufacturing, construction, and film. Secondly, as a senior policy advisor where I advise on health and safety regulations. And now I'm a manager within the risk analysis unit. So I'm going to be drawing from all of my positions during this presentation to talk about occupational heat stress. So the purpose of this presentation is to learn about the risk of heat stress in workers to workers in your production, both outdoors and indoors, and to increase the awareness of mechanisms to prevent heat stress and strain in workers. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to be covering these 6 items. First, I'm going to be talking about the risk analysis unit, so who we are within WorkSafe. Then secondly, talking about the global and local implications of climate change. Then thirdly, talk a little bit about heat regulation and how that happens within our body. Then next, I'll talk about a different type of regulation, which is the occupational health and safety regulations. I'll roll into some practical control options that you can use within the entertainment industry. And then finally, I'll close off with talking about some of the WorkSafe initiatives and resources. So first, the risk analysis unit. Who are we? We're one of 6 prevention services departments at WorkSafeBC. Our value is to identify workplace risks before harm is done and to assess the impacts of occupational health and safety as a result of changes in technology, process, and innovation. So how do we do that? You're familiar with looking at claims and incidence data, which are lagging indicators or aligned risk. At the RAU, we focus on unaligned risks or leading indicators. We find these unaligned risks through signals. So we have AI that actually scans the environmental reports as well as media, government documents, and others to show trends in these 4 categories listed here. Climate change and heat stress are within the emerging risks. We're collaborating with academics and other organizations such as BC CDC to look at the challenges, and then we work together to improve worker safety as interest groups and through research grants. So let's move on to our topic today. To put it into context, the impact of this risk and why we're talking about heat stress today, I've attached this graphic. It's a pretty neat graphic from NASA. It's deceptively simple, yet really highly effective in terms of data visualization. And it shows the monthly global temperatures between 1880 to 2021, where the temperatures vary between plus or minus 1 degree Celsius from expected. You'll see that there was a blip within the temperatures in the 1940s, but you saw the temperatures went down. You'll also see a huge increase in the 1980s, and it's coming up here right now, but the temperatures never went down from that. Now, in terms of risk signals, you see we see about 5 signals per month in regards to heat stress, but during the heat dome period from June to July of 2021, we saw about 12 during that period. I'll let the graphic play out here. So you can definitely see it kind of getting spiraling a little out of control there. So in June of 2021, the temperatures fell in multiple North American cities during the heat wave that were historic and dangerous. Now, this is an image that was also created by NASA, which shows the temperature anomalies on June 27th. The red areas where you see right here show air temperatures that climbed more than 15 degrees Celsius higher than the 2014 to 2020 average for the same day. Now, one of my strong suits is not being a meteorologist, but my understanding in terms of layman's terms is that the temperature got really high. And because the environment was unable to cool itself at night and the heat retained overnight, the added heat from the sun during the day accumulated, and it resulted in a massive increase in temperatures. So how is it affecting BC worker population? Information on this slide are from the heat dome period from June 24th to July 7th of 2021. So for heat stress, the most affected industries that called our WorkSafeBC hotline regarding heat-related issues were workplaces that were indoors. So you'll see there's the hospitality, accommodation, and the healthcare and social assistance, which are in kind of the lighter blue here. We got less calls from outdoor workplaces such as construction, but you did see here in the lighter blue, or actually even lighter blue, you'll see that there is kind of a lesser call from normal calls that we get. Now, this isn't surprising, as anecdotally through prevention officers, heat stress is well acknowledged by outdoor workers, but it's very poorly acknowledged by those working indoors. Let's talk specifically about your industry though, which I've highlighted here, and that's shown in the brown bars here. Now, during this period, we had about 14 calls from the entertainment industry, and entertainment industry being motion picture, performing arts, and live events. We had 3 that were general inquiries about heat or heat stress, and they just wanted more information. We had 2 that were specifically asking about the requirements of the occupational health and safety regulations, and then 3 specifically asking about safe temperatures to work at. We had 1 call in regards to the use of clothing within hot environments, and then 5 were actually as a result of an incident. So either from a workplace fainting, a hospitalization, or medical distress. So not enough information was collected to determine whether these calls were regarding indoor or outdoor workplaces. Now let's look at WorkSafeBC data over the past 10 years for heat stress related claims from the same industry sector. You'll see with the orange bars, these are the number of claims in this industry sector that were received per year. The green lines show the percentage of heat stress related claims that can be attributed to this sector in comparison to all others. So all of the claims for this industry sector were attributed to the Motion Picture Commercial and Television Classification Unit, or CU. Motion picture had only time loss claims, whereas 5% of other sector claims were healthcare only. So some highlights I wanted to note in regards to this graph. In 2016, the percentage of heat-related claims attributed to the motion picture sector were more than double than other years. So you'll see that there was a peak here. In 2018, you'll see that there was a somewhat higher number of claims than any other year. And that was because in 2018, there was a heat wave, but it was also recorded as the worst year for wildfires. And not surprisingly, in 2021, that was our heat dome period, and we had a substantially higher number of heat stress related claims than all other years. So this year is associated with a hot spell in April, and we might potentially have another heat dome. So there may be another increase in claims in that regards. So let's look at how we can prevent these claims. So we must first understand our body mechanics on heat regulation. So our bodies naturally try to maintain a temperature between 36 to 38 degrees Celsius. And heat stress happens when your body gains heat faster than you can get rid of it and your body temperature increases. Now, heat disorders are health problems that result from heat stress. So there are three primary factors to determine if heat stress occurs. First is the environment. This speaks to temperature, humidity, airflow, and direct heat exposure. Second is work, how much energy or workload is needed for the work and how fast the work is being done. And then thirdly is the worker and how able the body is to handle the heat. So let's focus on some of these factors. First is acclimatization, which means a worker who is accustomed to the work and work rate in a hot environment and has done it consistently for 7 consecutive days. Now, typically to acclimatize, you start with a reduced workload and then gradually increase each shift. Now, I realize that it might not be feasible when working in a production. So as you go from, AC to a hot outside, back into AC. Secondly, there are personal factors to consider. These are personal risk factors for those that reduce a person's tolerance for heat stress. So this could be hydration state, gender, age, obesity, or even the use of medication and drugs. And then thirdly, clothing, as well as personal protective equipment, which is PPE. And these include clothing material or costumes worn, as well as maybe respiratory protection or protective suits, for example, when you're constructing or painting a set. Now, a takeaway from this slide is that environmental measurements are only part of determining if a worker will experience heat stress. We've got worker personal factors as well as work factors that could make them more susceptible. So now let's apply these concepts. So heat can come in 2 ways to a body. First, internally, from muscle activity and metabolism. So this is most affected from the work that's being done. So major heat is usually generated within the core and released in the head, biceps and triceps, as well as quads and hamstrings. You also get heat externally from the environment, so from high temperatures or as well as direct sun exposure. So as a result, the worker's body can remove excess heat to an extent by either increasing blood flow to the skin through convective cooling or through sweating. So the body's heat removal is better if there's low humidity and airflow, so ventilation, but it's very limited if there is high humidity and stagnant air. It's also affected by worker risk factors. So if the worker is lack of hydration or lack of acclimatization, or if they're wearing costumes or personal protective equipment, but then also personal risk factors or medical conditions affecting their sweating. So there are several heat disorders that could result from improper heat balance, and these increase in severity of health concerns. So treatment will also increase in severity as well. So essentially, these go from bad to worse. So I think Anand will be activating a poll regarding whether you've experienced any of these disorders. And I'll talk a little bit about these while you guys answer the poll. So the first few can be self-diagnosed, where the last couple may need external help. So in terms of heat rashes are rashes with itchy spasms and prickly sensations, and that has the simplest of treatment. You leave the hot environment and you keep your skin clean, cool, and dry. The next three are cramps, fainting, and exhaustion, which have similar treatments. Now for heat cramps, that's caused by losing too much salt from sweating. So you'll get painful cramps, typically those in the most used muscles, and then excessive sweating. We've got heat syncope or heat fainting, which you would experience lightheadedness, dizziness, and fainting. And then there's heat exhaustion. So similar symptoms as to heat fainting and cramps, but you also see some shallow, quick breaths, some rapid pulse, clammy skin, which is the same as mild shock. But then you get profuse sweating, so lots and lots of sweat. So in all of these, the treatment is to cool the body. So either move into a cooler environment and then drink water if you're fully alert and not nauseated. In fainting, though, you definitely want to ensure that you sit or lay down if you're beginning to feel these symptoms. And in exhaustion, it's important that you treat immediately because this could progress to heat stroke. For heat stroke, this is the most severe of the heat disorders. The signs and symptoms are that you're not sweating or the person's not sweating with hot, dry, flushed skin. They may be agitated, confused with a decreased level of consciousness, and they might actually experience headaches, vomiting, and nausea. You'll see an increased breathing rate and a regular pulse rate, and they might actually go into seizure, shock, or cardiac arrest. In this case, you want to ensure that medical treatment is sought immediately. So because heat stroke can be a life-threatening event. The person, you want to lay down the person on their back or even put them in a prone position if there's a risk of vomiting while they're seizuring. And you definitely want to cool off the body and drink water if they're fully alert and not nauseated. So let's take a look at the poll. It looks like, I don't know if you guys can see that on my screen, but it looks like there are, it looks like a lot of people have experienced some exhaustion. So 50% of users have experienced exhaustion. People have experienced cramps, fainting, and rashes. And wow, 2 people have actually seen strokes. So that's quite frightening. All right. So let's continue on. So now let's switch gears now and talk about how to prevent these disorders. Now, heat exposure is addressed in a couple places within the BC Occupational Health and Safety Regulations. Thermal comfort is addressed in Section 480, which requires the employer to ensure that the temperature and humidity levels within the indoor work environment are maintained within acceptable comfort ranges as far as practicable. Now, heat exposure, OHSR Part 7, would be the most applicable to our situations during the temperature extremes. Because the heat exposure guidelines are quite detailed, there are several guidelines providing information about the application and implementation of these requirements. Now, I'm not going to talk about each of the occupational health and safety regulation sections, but I will provide some highlights to note. First is the application. So the regulation applies to workplaces where thermal conditions could cause heat stress or raise a worker's core body temperature over 38 degrees Celsius. The regulation also addresses the screening criteria for heat stress exposures, which I've covered in the next slide. Now, note this section doesn't apply to firefighting if provisions are in place to ensure the firefighter's core body temperature is maintained below 38 degrees Celsius. Now, I'd like to hear from yourselves, and I'd like you to type into the chat. Thinking of the entertainment industry, what are some examples that might meet this criteria? And I'll give you guys a few minutes to type into the chat here, and I'll get Anand to read out some of the examples.
Waiting.
Don't be
Who's gonna
shy.
first? Thinking of the entertainment industry. Well, that's you making that comment. Yeah, don't be shy. You didn't realize that this was going to be an audience participation thing, did you? So what are some wait, what do we got? Oh, now I got to catch up. Okay, being a PA that is stationed outside, not in the shade, absolutely. I can say from my experience that I suffered a heat exposure in my early days as a production assistant out in the sun all day. Being outside in high temperatures wearing heavy winter clothes. I'm thinking that more as a performer, filming those Christmas movies in July, right? Shooting on an airport tarmac, being in a studio on a day above 25 degrees Celsius with lights on and air coming on and off. It can quickly raise the temperatures. I'm in Florida where outdoor events, concerts and such are common, being in an unventilated lockup, yeah. PA doing traffic control on hot roads, outdoor locations during hot days. Spotlights can all definitely add to the heat. Loading counterweights in a fly tower or elevated fly gallery. Yeah. Working on the fireworks barges during the summer. So there's a bunch of things there. Oh, performing a leading role here in Vancouver during the heat wave wildfires in 2018 for no pay, no wind, dresser drops assistance, 7 dog dance, many scenes, 25 plus days, and no air conditioning. That sounds like fun.
Excellent.
Shooting in a small space with limited air ventilation. In the studio, typically the air conditioned the set where the actors are, but not the general studio. So the set itself, but not the periphery. Studios with trans lights with lack of AC units to cool the size of the area, outside filming during heat waves, very little shade. So
excellent. No, you guys, those are great examples. So I saw that there was you mentioned some radiant production sets with radiant heat sources, such as outdoors from the sun, as well as someone mentioned lights inside. Some of you also mentioned strenuous activities being performed while wearing perhaps heavy clothing, as well as just wearing personal protective equipment. I think there was a set design or props discussion there as well. So yeah, excellent. Those are definitely situations that would apply to our regulation. So let's look at it from the screening criteria. Secondly, in relation to the factors to increase risk, screening criteria reference the WBGT, or the wet bulb globe temperature, which is an index of the environment. You'll see that the increased risk is seen if there's a combination of high humidity, heavy workload, or excessive radiant heat. Now, here's some examples of different types of WBGTs that measure these parameters. This is an older one that I'm used to, but they've got newer, funkier technology models here that you might see around in your workplace. Now, the measured WBGT values might be adjusted for the contributions of work demands and clothing. And they must be adjusted. Like we covered earlier, for work demands, the consideration is for the intensity of the work or the metabolic rate. So either light, moderate, or heavy work, and the work recovery cycle. Now, we talked about clothing as well. And as you remember from our previous slide, the body's main heat removal mechanism is the evaporation of sweat from the skin. So the clothing worn by workers affects the body's ability to remove heat. So it's best to use the suggested work demand values and clothing adjustment factors in the guidelines, or just consult a health and safety specialist. Third is an exposure control plan. An ECP, or an exposure control plan, is required if a worker is or may be exposed to one of the three conditions I mentioned in my previous slide. Now, the elements of an ECP should consider local conditions. So creation should involve an occupational health and safety rep or a joint occupational health and safety committee member. And assistance can be sought from Actsafe or from an OHS professional. Now, in terms of an ECP, or an exposure control plan, it should contain elements of worker awareness training, policies such as a acclimatization plan, or even an early recognition of heat-related signs and symptoms in workers, environmental surveillance, and then an emergency response plan for workers who might appear confused, disoriented, or have chills or seizures. Now, an ECP should also contain general controls, which are heat stress practices to reduce the risk of developing heat-related disorders. So some key elements include fluid replacement, heat status monitoring or self-determination of exposures, and adjustments of expectations based on acclimatization state. Now, these practices require full cooperation of management and workers. So in addition to the general controls, appropriate job-specific controls are often needed to provide adequate protection. So first is the implementation of engineering controls. And these are controls that reduce the metabolic rate, provide general air movement, removes heat, and shields radiant heat sources. When the risk of heat stress is not reduced to an acceptable level, then further controls are needed. So administrative controls are needed to set acceptable exposure times, allow sufficient recovery, and limit physiological strain. And then finally, the effective personal protective equipment and personal protection are specific for work practices and conditions. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to walk through the general approach, re-emphasizing some of the things we've learned from earlier. So first is the assessment. We need to determine the tasks, areas, and occupations that put workers at risk of heat-related disorders. So you'll have areas with high humidity or with temperatures above 23 degrees Celsius. That would be jobs or tasks that require medium to high exertion, or areas, tasks, or occupations identified as high risk through incident investigations, or where workers have experienced concerns about heat-related stress. More details about this is located in our guidelines, which I've kind of listed here. Now, once it's determined which occupations, tasks, or areas should be monitored, the risk of developing a heat-related disorder should be evaluated. So you would be evaluating environmental parameters, such as air temperature, wind, humidity, and radiation. And in some cases, monitoring by WibJet, which is the preferred method, may not be necessary. And so you can actually use a dry bulb thermometer, or a humidex index might be acceptable. Other methods might also use direct measurement of body temperature, or maybe a heart rate monitoring. Now, this collectively is known as the assessment phase, and I've included the guideline references here so that you can get some more explanation of what the process is involved. So a couple things I want to note. First, it's important to measure at your production site. Online temperature measurements typically are measured from YVR and can differ from your site. There's also microclimates that exist in different areas, so it's best to measure directly at your site so you can accurately reflect the risk. Second, understand how the measurements can be used and the limitations. So for example, humidex readings don't have the ability to correct for clothing or heavy costumes. So it's important to understand not only the measurements, but also that what it does and doesn't account for. Now, going back to assessments, if after assessment there's an unacceptable risk of heat stress, then you need to put together a heat stress management plan or an exposure control plan, and that needs to be developed and implemented. as well as implementing heat stress controls. So engineering controls, and if not practicable, then administrative controls or personal protective equipment. Other applicable requirements include the provision of water. So employers must ensure an adequate supply of cool, potable water close to the work area for workers. And then removal from and treatment for heat exposure. So if, for example, a worker shows signs or reports symptoms of heat stress or strain, the worker must be removed from the hot environment and treated by an occupational first aid attendant or a physician. Now, let's briefly talk about controls and what that means in terms of practicability. Before I go into this, I'd like to see what you've seen in your production to reduce the risk of heat stress. So I'd like you to just type into the chat what you've seen. What methods have you seen in your production to kind of reduce heat stress within workers?
I'm back. All right.
Perfect. And
What have we-
Anand, I'm going to get you to just summarize some of the examples that are typed in there.
Sure. We a lot of people are typing in cooling tents, misting fans. There's cold water, so water, air conditioning, misting areas. None at all. Air conditioning units, yeah, tents, water misters, water, ventilation, so opening windows, skylights, fans. Electrolyte replacement is another one on the list here.
Perfect.
The Pepsi
right.
misting tent.
We all love those, eh? The
I
Pepsi
don't know
tent.
if I want to be misted by Pepsi, but I prefer water. But
All right.
there you go.
Well, let's talk a little bit about these controls. That is great. It's great that you guys recognize that there are controls out there. So I recognize that we're a little short on time, so I'll quicken it up. Now, in terms of controls, we classify them into 3 different categories. First one is engineering controls, where indoor workplaces have more options of engineering controls than outdoor. Some examples you guys mentioned, air conditioning, and no one mentioned dehumidifiers, but these 2 devices help reduce humidity, where air conditioning actually increases ventilation at the same time. Some of you mentioned some shielding from heat sources, so tents, hats, or sun covers, and some of you mentioned fans as well. So fans can be used for spot cooling when temperatures are less than 35 degrees Celsius. Why less than 35 degrees Celsius? It's because 35 degrees Celsius is skin temperature. So if it exceeds that, then the fan would be increasing the heat to the body. Also note that if you are using fans, it may interfere with some of the local exhaust ventilation for contaminant control. Some of you mentioned misting stations, which is also an option, but it's a caveat. It's really good in dry environments because it can add to some short-term conductive cooling, but the water has to be cold. However, there's also a bad part to it because it does increase humidity and it actually lessens the body's ability to actually release the heat from the body. So moving on, when there's the risk of heat stress, when heat stress isn't able to be reduced to an acceptable level by engineering controls, then you need further controls. So there's administrative controls, which are modifications or changes to work practices that reduce the risk of heat stress. So for example, some of you also mentioned this is just work rest breaks to allow the body temperature to cool. It's important to note that it's not good enough to sit underneath the shade. You need longer time to cool the body temperature enough to prevent developing a heat disorder. Some other examples are rotating work activities or increasing the number of workers to allow some downtime for each worker to cool themselves. Schedule physical activity during the cooler times, which I noticed someone actually mentioned that. And then finally, avoid working alone where heat stress is possible. Now, the last line of defense is personal protective equipment or PPE, and that's specific for work practices and conditions and should only be used if it's effectively providing protection equal or greater than administrative controls. I noticed someone said ice packs taped to actors' bodies under heavy costumes, and I guess that would be an example of a cooling vest, an impromptu cooling vest, which would be an example of a PPE. Now, note that you could use multiple controls from all three categories to implement on your work site to reduce the risk of heat stress. So what are we doing at WorkSafeBC to address these risks? We've taken three approaches. First, industry awareness. So we understand that workers and employers that fully understand the risks are more likely to take steps to reduce exposures. So we've collaborated with several agencies to increase awareness through our occupational disease initiative. Now, particularly, we've collaborated on a pilot project to incorporate sun safety and heat stress training into curriculum at trade and technology schools, as well as young worker outreach initiatives involving students and workers aged 15 to 25. Our second element is inspection programs, where we're focusing on work sites with the highest risk, so construction, agriculture, municipalities, and manufacturing industries. So this year, we'll be focusing on indoor work sites as well, with the focus of the visits being to promote awareness and develop solar radiation and heat stress programs for workers, but also to enforce the regulation and to help employers achieve compliance. And then the third element are resources, which I'll touch on in the next couple of slides. So here's a snapshot of this year's campaign landing page. We've got links to the resources that can be found on this site. And as part of the campaign, we highlight resources from WorkSafeBC.com, as well as our heat stress booklet, which has been around for a little while. It's been revamped. It's getting revamped again with some more up-to-date pictures. Something that's pretty cool that we've equipped our prevention officers with these past couple of years are UV exposure stickers and bands. So these change color when they're exposed to radiation. So while these do work on sun exposure, it gives a good indication of heat load that's received by the worker during their work. Now, in terms of resource materials, we've partnered with CAREX and Sun Safety at Work to produce resources for workers and employers to clarify the risks, hazards, and controls that are most relevant in their workplace. So these are available here at sunsafetyatwork.ca, and I see that Natalie typed that into the chat as well. And here are some examples of resources that are available to download and or customize to specific workplaces such as yourselves. Some highlights I want to note is that there are risk assessment templates for heat stress. So for example, there's daily assessment records, templates for the use of humidex, an operational review, and as well as technical guides. There are also templates for heat stress policies for small and large workplaces, as well as documents addressing roles and responsibilities. We've got on their presentations, safety talks or toolbox talks for workers on heat stress. And there's videos and fact sheets for both employers and workers. One positive is that it's available in multi-languages. So we've got English, French, and I saw some Spanish in there as well. Next, I'm going to throw this over to Natalie at WorkSafe to discuss resources that Actsafe has developed and some upcoming plans. So over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Percy. So the first resource that we have available, it is the information sheet. It is, if you guys heard about before, we called that before it is a bulletins. But we would like to change that for information sheet to be more informative resource created by Actsafe team, our committee working group as well. We have a working group working on our materials and also some specialists such as WorkSafeBC or contractors. And then we do that together to bring to the industry on both sides. such as motion picture and performing arts. Can you press next, please? How to use it? We heard so many times when we go to visit, and some people use this information sheet during that production, and they should be used on pre-production phase when you can analyze the information sheet, and maybe you need to create the next step, which it is what you need to do after you read your information sheet, right? You will create maybe your risk assessment based on that, and also your ECP. But that is very unique, right? This is why we create an information sheet with some guidelines for you, and you will see what is applicable to your production. Next, please. So coming soon, we hope we have a template for you guys. We are working with the partnership with WorkSafeBC in consultation with them to create some kind of template for the industry. As Percy said, the plan is very unique. The heat stress prevention program is very unique. Because it depends on so many facts, so many activity, or the personal information from your worker, or where you make that production. So we try to figure out how we will make a template for you guys. We will work on that as soon as possible. I know we are almost on the summer, but we hope that we have that resource soon. And some things that you could look at and hope that we have for you, it is the statements of purpose and responsibilities on your side as an employer and as a worker as well. We will try to make very generic part with some questions for you on when I need to do the risk assessment, how I will do that, how I will apply the hierarchy of controls based on my activity as an employer. Like Percy said, we should have education and training for all workers who will be exposed on that hazard. Writing work procedures, hygiene facilities such as, like you guys just said, some water availability or a shelter, what you have, and also health monitoring when is required based on your risk assessment, documentation when is required based on your risk assessment again. Please, next. And that is referring to the regulation. So another resources that we are working on for next year, we expect to have our services inside for you guys, especially when we are talking about air quality, heat stress, is something that we should do that on set for you. And we are looking forward to do that next year. Hope we can help you with more information in this project for you guys. But just keep in mind, it's something that you should do on site in the day that you should. So it is something that should be doing in local. So I hope we can help you guys with more resources. Other resources that I didn't add it on this slide, it is our safety scene articles, which this month, I think this month or next month, if I'm not mistaken, will be about emergency preparedness. And we have article from WorkSafeBC as well about heat stress. So coming up, just keep your eyes on our website for the safety scene, and is amazing resource, help you guys to understand a little bit more on the signs and symptoms, and also how to prepare your ECP. So thank you so much, and I will share with you guys more resources on chat soon about from Actsafe. Thank you. Over to you again.
Perfect. Thanks, Natalie. And I guess that's the end of my presentation as well. So it's my turn to be in the hot seat in regards to questions.
So we do have a few on in the Q&A. One of them dating back to slide number 7. There was a question about reporting to WorkSafeBC and the reports that you received last year, the question was, are these phone calls or is this information gleaned from first aid reports submitted to WorkSafeBC?
Oh, slide number 7 in regards to the effects to or the rate-related claims. So
Yes.
in regards to the ones specifically to heat domes, it is the calls. So we don't glean any of the first aid reports. The first aid reports actually go towards the claims side. So you'll see when I showed that bar chart with the line graph that's superimposed on top of that, those are for the claims. And so that's what happens when a Form 7 or any time loss claim is submitted through WorkSafe. Hopefully that answers that question.
I hope it does. Let us know if you need a little bit further on that. The next question is an interesting one, and I'm just going to read it as it was submitted. Being a redhead, I cannot do sun. Heat isn't so bad, though. Are there any other identifiable groups that are more at risk?
Very good question. I'm not an occupational health physician, but I do understand, as I mentioned before, it's anything that affects your body's cooling capacity. So, anyone that has decreased abilities to sweat. So I know for certain medical conditions, they don't sweat. And so there's the inability to actually remove the body core heat. Also, if you're on any medications or drugs that might affect your sweating, as well as it could be age related as well. So sometimes the older populations have difficulties in terms of removing heat from their body. There's several other factors as well. It could be in regards to obesity as well as fitness levels. So many different factors, but definitely it isn't just the redheads. So you guys, you're not alone.
Excellent. So a bunch of other questions, and we're going to try and get through what we can in the short time that we have. Question about measuring at physical locations. What tool do we use? And I believe that would probably be the widget.
Yeah, so ideally, the most ideal approach is the widget, the wet bulb globe temperature, and that's the best approach. However, you can use, as I said, the dry bulb, so just basically your thermometer. But you can also use the Humidex ratings, now the Humidex index as well. There are other measurement tools that you can use to determine whether someone would undergo or if there is a risk of heat stress. So as I said, you can do some body measurements of workers on the site. So either heart rate monitoring, or you can do temperature monitoring through the mouth, so oral temperature, as well as there are devices that can go in the ear that measures the core body temperature. So there are those tools as well. Now, as I said previously, it's important to actually measure at your site, just because if you do online, if you take the online measurements and you look at it, it actually measures from YVR from a different location. So it isn't a really accurate reflection of the risks that's happening at your site at that particular time, or the duration that you're actually working. So definitely important to measure at your site.
And is there any given frequency throughout the day to test? It's like once an hour, once every 4 hours? Does it?
We don't specifically measure, say, a specific frequency. However, if there is any changing conditions, so you might, put up some more lights, or, the sun exposure, you're moving from a shaded area to a direct sun area. Definitely you want to make measurements or make new measurements at that time as well. So it's good to check periodically throughout the day to make sure that that your risk assessment is still accurate. But there isn't a prescribed period that you need to frequency in terms of checking.
Excellent. Thank you, Percy. Next question I'm going to skip to is, and actually it was in the chat. What is this? A little bit of an expansion on how the sun exposure wearables work. When they change color, they basically mean higher the risk, higher the hazard. When should we start worrying about things?
So those sun exposure, that's a very good question. In terms of the sun exposure wearables, those were developed in combination with Carex and ourselves. Carex had a higher focus on more solar radiation, and so how much sun you're getting and the potential for cancer. We were looking at it from a heat perspective, and we thought that the sun exposure wearables were really good indicator for how much how much sun you've been exposed to, and as a result, how much heat you might be taking into your body. So it's really just an indicator, not it's a surrogate, but it really doesn't replace any of the monitoring done by WibJet or any of the direct read measurements that you'll be taking on your site.
Excellent. Good question in the Q&A that just popped up. Is there a outdoor stop work temperature limit? But what temperature should we absolutely end things for the work?
There is not, but the most ideal is to make sure that you want to ensure that the worker's core body temperature actually stays between 36 to 38. So any temperature or any work conditions that increase the core body temperature to above 38 is a concern. Now, as I said before, it's not just work temperature. It's not just environment temperature. There's 3 factors that play into whether you would get heat stress. The environment is one of them, which is great. So you touched on is temperature and air temperature, but you definitely want to look at as well as ventilation, humidity. You want to look at the environmental conditions. You also want to look at the work, so workload, as well as just work frequency. So, your work cycle. And then you want to look at the worker factors. So personal factors, as well as, costumes or any like clothing that's being worn. So there's those 3 elements that need to be taken into consideration when you're looking at perhaps stopping work or moving your work into a different type of frequency. So it's not just air temperature that is the concern.
Excellent. So I think I'm going to unfortunately have to cut it at that point. We are a little bit over time, and we've only got 2 minutes left before Percy has to get to another engagement. So I understand there's a bunch of questions in the Q&A and in the chat that we were hoping to get to, we just don't have time. So I appreciate everybody that's been here today and engaging with us through the Q&A and the chat. It's questions like this and conversations like this that are only going to make our industry richer when it comes to providing safe workplaces for all of our workers. I want to thank Percy for being here with us and taking the time to present specifically on this subject when it comes to entertainment workplaces. Thank you so much, Percy. A big round of applause to you. Thank you, Natalie, for jumping in and explaining a little bit about what Actsafe has coming up as well. Something going on outside my window. There's people yelling. And I also want to thank the Actsafe team for helping to stage, organize, and pull off this great event. Look for it on the Actsafe YouTube page. Like I said, there's a whole bunch of other stuff there that I think you might find fascinating. So visit that. WorkSafeBC has a bunch of great resources, as was outlined. Actsafe's website has a bunch of great resources, as Natalie mentioned. And with that, unless there's anybody else that on the screen that wants to say anything, all good. Thank you all for coming, and keep an eye out for our next webinar to be continued maybe. Thank you, everybody. Have a fabulous Friday and a fabulous weekend.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.